Welcome everyone to Book Carnival from Orange, California. And we're going to be talking with James T. Bartlett tonight and his book, The Alaskan Blond. James, say something so that you can overpower Tammy's phone.
Okay, and hello everybody. Thanks to all of you for turning up, whether you're seeing it now or whether you're seeing it later. And thank you, Anne, for inviting me.
No problem. And I'll show the book afterwards. I just wanted to get your charming, handsome face up there so that we know who we were talking to tonight. And thanks so much for being with us, James. Before we get to your book, I'd like to know how you got to this point. What has your career been in the past, and have you always wanted to be a writer, or is this something that's come up a little later?
Well, really, in sort of a summary, I have been like a freelance journalist pretty much for like 20 years or so now. You know, I did the sort of obligatory media studies degree at university, which was back when it wasn't the degree that everybody took. And I sort of worked in production a little bit after that, but I wasn't that keen on it so much. But I'd always liked writing. And then I started to work in music licensing, and that led me to move to a new city from London. I moved to Belfast in Northern Ireland, and that was where I felt at the time that I could possibly give writing a bit more of a try, screenwriting and film reviews and restaurant reviews and really anything, because I was in a new city and I was discovering it. And certainly Belfast and Northern Ireland was a place that a lot of people didn't write about or know much about, besides, you know, the less than great stuff. And it really sort of went from there. And then I just carried on doing it because I liked it. I don't know whether it was a family thing. My grandfather, who actually died before I was born, he was a journalist, much more successful than I. He worked for one of the big newspapers in England. I don't know whether that went in at all in the genes, but as far as getting to where I am today, and this book, I guess, was that when I moved to Los Angeles, you know, I tried to learn a bit about the city, and I wrote a little bit about it as well, sort of a bit touristy, a bit travel-y as well. And I did a couple of guidebooks to LA, really because they were guidebooks that I wanted to find but couldn't find in the bookshops. And they were guides to, you know, bars and restaurants and hotels, but they looked at crime or ghost stories or unusual stories to do with these locations. And I thought that was a little more interesting than just reading about, you know, the history and the architecture. And one of the stories in the second book I did led to me doing this book, because it just caught my imagination. And I thought to myself, well, I wonder what happened there. What happened there in the future? What happened afterwards? What happened with the murder? What happened to the people? And that was, you know, 5 years ago. And that was how long it sort of took me doing the book on and off to get it to a stage where, you know, it came out recently.
So it sounds like between the travel books and anything else you've done, it's in a very inquisitive mind. You just want to know everything that's going on. And
well, and I'm sure my wife would disagree, because I'm always, I mean, that I'm the sort of person, like, if I see a squirrel, I'm running after it, you know, to see where the squirrel goes, that kind of thing. I think it's just, I'm interested in stuff that I'm interested in. You know, you've spoken to so many authors, Anne, and I'm sure they always say, or so many of them say, write about what you're interested in and write about what you like to read about. And so I always try and write and do journalistic pieces about things I'm interested in. You know, if I can't find out the answer when I Google it, then I want to find out what the answer is. And I figure that might be an article that someone else will be interested in. And sometimes they are, and sometimes they aren't. But, you know, sports and politics, you know, anyone can do that. You know, I'm not interested in that, but I'm interested in, you know, what's behind the stage at the Hollywood Bowl. I'd like to know that. I want to know what's there, you know. So that would be something I might try and pitch, you know.
I think that you talk to the average person that way because they don't have the opportunity to find out.
Yeah, it's all about things that I want to know about, and just the idea of saying, you know, I'm writing an article, or I'm a journalist, or I'm a freelancer, that seems to open a lot of doors. And often, a lot of the time, as I found out when I was doing this book, people are interested that someone's interested in what they're doing. You know, especially if it's something unusual or it's something unheralded or it's something that's, you know, behind the scenes, as it were. They don't get asked a lot about what they're doing, and they don't get asked a lot by people who are really interested. And I'm always genuinely interested, because otherwise I wouldn't be there in the first place. I figure that's only fair.
But I think that's contagious, and people can sense that by the way with your enthusiasm and the questions that you ask and the direction you're going. So I think that that means a lot to the people. They know that you're taking them seriously.
Yeah.
Or funny, depending on what they want to be taken as.
Yeah. I mean, it did help again with this book, because you know, I don't have a lot of books within the true crime genre are often written by people who have a connection to the story. You know, it's someone whose mother or brother or husband or father has been killed, or they knew the person who was killed, or it affected their community, or it affected them in some personal way. I didn't have any connection to this whatsoever. You know, and initially I thought that would be a problem for doing the interviews. And some people said to me, like, why are you interested in this? Why does this concern you? You know, it happened 70 years ago. Why do you care? What's in it for you? You know, why would you be? And I would just say, honestly, I said, well, I just wonder what happened. And
so what was the first thing that caught your attention about the people that make up this story?
Yeah, it was really two things that came at the same time. The first thing was that when I read about the case, which was happened in 1953, so obviously it's a long time ago, I thought to myself, when I just read the newspaper reports, I think, well, I can see what happened there. I can guess what happened there. I don't need to read any further reports. I'm sure this happened and this happened. And it seemed incredibly contemporary to me. I felt like if it had happened today, I felt it would play out in the same way. What happened to the people who were involved, how they were treated in the media, how they were treated by their friends and their neighbors and so forth. The other thing was that the murder victim, who was Cecil Wells, and his wife, Diane Wells, who was charged with his murder, they had a young son who was 3 when the murder happened. And there was a custody battle over the son. And I wondered what had happened to the son. And I really just thought, like we all do these days, I just thought, well, I can Google it and I'll find out there'll be a book about it, or, you know, there'll have been a series of articles or something about this story, because it was a huge story at the time, you know. I found that there was a piece in Life, there was a piece in Newsweek, there was a piece in Jet. It was in several of the pulp magazines in the 50s, which were great, which I managed to get off eBay. But I never managed to find anything about what happened to the child. And I just wondered what happened. So I Googled it, as we do. And one of the things that came up was a half sister of his had actually posted on a forum saying, does anyone know what happened to this child? Because he was my half brother, and I haven't been in touch with him for 30 years. And that kind of, and I just thought, wow, so she couldn't find him, you know, and she was related.
Yeah.
And it just kind of went from there. And then I found another half sister, and I got to speak to her at length. And it just went from there. And really what I found out was, amongst all the family members, who were all in their 70s and 80s now, especially the ones who were children at the time, none of them really knew much about the murder or what happened afterwards. They all kind of said it wasn't really talked about. It was taboo, and it was never discussed. And they were all kind of saying to me, well, what do you know? And I said, well, I don't really know anything, you know, and that was what sort of spurred me to go ahead, because they said, well, please tell us, because we don't really know what happened.
So they weren't involved or present at the trial or anything that went on?
Now that's where we get to it. Some spoilers, that it actually didn't go to trial in the end. There was a sort of a bouncing ball effect that for 6 or 7 years, it kept being put on the books for a trial, and then pulled back off the books, and then put on again, and then taken off, and backwards and forwards, essentially because they didn't quite have enough evidence. They never found the murder weapon, which is always important. And they never quite had enough evidence. And then a particularly interesting side of it I found was that really, when Alaska became a state in 1959, they really drew a line under everything that had happened before. And so the trial that never happened, or at least what the other person who was indicted for the crime, which was Diane Wells and her lover, Johnny Warren, who was a musician, he was exonerated in 1960, just told that the case was never going ahead and that he was a free man. And he hadn't been in prison that whole time, at least, thank goodness. But he had been on a regular basis. They were saying, right, there's going to be a trial. In 3 months' time, the trial is starting. And then they'd cancel it. And then they'd start it again and they'd cancel it. And that was what happened, was Alaska became a state and they really just wanted to draw a veil over everything that was left behind from when it was a territory. And this murder was a particularly notable one that I'm sure they didn't want to keep hanging over them, because I don't think they'd have got a conviction. And it was, when you're trying to become a state, you don't need problems with law and order. And, you know, rich businessmen who were influential getting killed in their homes and the crime not being solved.
Interesting. It had never occurred to me that a territory becoming a state could do that, could just kind of have their past vanish, if you will.
Oh yes, it really does. And it was certainly apparent when I was doing my research. Anything that I was looking for when it was a territory was always difficult to get hold of, was always scattered all over the place, and the records weren't very good. But as soon as you get past 1959, it's a state. Everyone knows where all the records are, and they're all up to date, and they're all filed, and you can get them easily, and you can get easy access to them because it was a state. Everything was different then. When it was a territory, no one really cared about it. You know, I mean, even, you know, initially they called it a folly. You know, when America bought Alaska initially, they thought it was a complete waste of money. You know, enormous amount of territory, nothing there and no people. You know, but then of course they had their various booms and busts. But even then, even as many Alaskans would say now, you know, the lower 48, or the outside, as they call it, you know, the contiguous US states, they really consider that they don't really care so much about Alaska and what Alaska does. You know, Alaskans tend to consider themselves, you know, Alaskans first, and then Americans, you know, because they're separate and they've always felt that they've been treated that way.
Well, and extremely independent people and what word do I want?
Self-reliant.
Yes, that's exactly what I wanted to say. And you have to be up there depending on where you live. So many people go there for the isolation and for the freedom of living a certain way.
Yes, I think it's the, you know, the old cliche of that, you know, if you shake America, you know, people end up at, you know, the four corners. Or if people want to get away and start again, they go as far as they can in one direction. So you get a lot of people coming to California because it's as far as you can go west. You get a lot of people in Florida because that's as far as you can go south, you know, and then as far as you can go in America, even though it's not attached, is Alaska. And, you know, Alaska's, as little as I knew about it, you know, Anchorage is their biggest city. That has 250,000 people now. But the next biggest one is basically Fairbanks with, you know, 30,000 people.
Oh my goodness.
You know, and that's, yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine that for the size of it, there's really one decent city in the whole of the country, in the whole of the state. And so if you do want to go up there and be on your own or just live a life of your own, you can do that. And really no one's going to bother you, because why would they? You know, why would they care? It's so far away. You know, it's when I was flying there, I didn't realize, you look at the map and you're like, you go over Canada to get to it, you know, and I didn't realize that. And when I was talking to people in Fairbanks, I said, you know, you're quite a way away from America, you know, because, well, obviously I'm English. So when I was there, they were twice as interested as why I was in Alaska to start with, because I wasn't really touristing. It wasn't tourist time. And why I was asking about this old case, they simply couldn't understand why I was interested. But they said, you know, I went into a couple of the bars and they said, you know, we get a lot of tourists here who come and say, well, I thought Alaska was an island, you know, because I see it in a box on the news with the weather. You know, Hawaii's in a box.
Oh, yes, yes.
Alaska's in a box. And we thought it was an island. We knew it wasn't attached. So we thought it was an island, you know, at the north of Canada. And so you've got one big city, and really that's it. So you go back to the 1950s, you know, there's 5,000 to 10,000 people max in the smaller cities.
Mhm.
You know, so when you go up there, it would have been a real culture shock and a real change, much as it would be now, I think, if you go anywhere other than probably Anchorage. And Juneau, that's sort of the administrative capital, but, you know, it's a bit like Sacramento. You know, it's the administrative capital, but no one really thinks of going to live in Sacramento, you know.
Well, and
You know,
then
going to Sacramento.
53, what kind of law enforcement did they have? It would have been minimal, wouldn't it?
Really good. Yeah, really good question. Had a lot to do with the case. Yeah, they had a local police force and a number of policemen, which was not well run at all. I do talk about that in the book, that there was state troopers, which there still are in Alaska, but they would be covering enormous areas that they would have to cover. There'd be local police, not well trained, not well supervised, not well looked after, not well equipped. Still the case today. That's still the case today, really. I mean, I just managed to get in the book at the end that Alaska just hired about a year ago their first CSI person, you know, their first dedicated crime scene investigator. The first one ever for the state was hired about 2 years ago.
My goodness.
And it was just because it wasn't that it wasn't a violent place. You know, it's a very, certainly within Fairbanks, because I know it better, it was a very male dominated place. You know, you have miners, you have fishermen, you have trappers, you know, certainly a lot of soldiers especially from pre-war, and then after the war, a lot of men coming up there, a lot of men coming to make their fortune. Then it was oil, a lot of it, all men. So there's a lot of violence, a lot of drinking, a lot of illegal gambling, there's prostitution. But again, in the 50s, you know, Fairbanks had its own street. It was called The Line. There was an actual street with organized brothels on it. Mm-hmm. Where men could go. And it was, you know, the police took a bit of money and turned a blind eye. And that was the way that they organized it. So when this murder happened, you know, it was a huge deal. And just like happens in a lot of real true crime cases, and you read in a lot of true crime books, all the people involved all started what they call a pissing match over each other. So the chief of police in Fairbanks, he felt that was their responsibility to sort this crime out. It happened in his city. He felt it was his responsibility. However, murder was a federal crime, or was considered to be. Obviously, it's not just a petty crime. So that theoretically meant the FBI should be involved, because it was a territory, not a state. There was the state troopers as well. And so everyone started to get involved, and they didn't communicate. And it was a big deal. It was a highball case. And the local police didn't do a great job, but they didn't have the facilities. You know, they didn't have a photographer, a crime scene photographer. They'd get the local, you know, portrait studio guy to come in, and he would take pictures of the crime scene. And they didn't have, of course, any of the technology that we expect today. But in this particular case, you know, to them, at least to the local Fairbanks police, it looked relatively clear cut from the beginning as to what had happened. But then, of course, there's a difference between that and proving it.
Set the scene for us now.
Okay, very briefly, so it was October 1953. There's a building that's still in the center of Fairbanks. It's called the Northwood Building. It's 8 stories high, which in those days was a skyscraper. It was the tallest building in town in those days. It's the second tallest now. It's still there. And it was a skyscraper, and it was very new, and it was very shiny, and it's kind of sort of H-shaped. It was sort of the basis for The Ice Palace, a book that Edna Ferber wrote.
Yes, which I loved. Okay.
Yeah, that was a book that she wrote. So it was in the center of town, very, very hip. And so Cecil Wells, who was a big car dealer, very much involved in the motor trade, and a lot of other investments, a very famous hot springs. He was involved in a project in Hawaii to build an apartment building, which is still there. So when he married Diane Wells, who was 20 years younger than him and his 5th wife, they moved into this fantastic new skyscraper in the middle of Fairbanks. About a year after they'd moved in, there was about 7:15 in the morning, Diane Wells banged on the door of a neighbor. There were short corridors. The building's still there, so I went in and took pictures. It's a short corridor, so she banged on the door of the neighbor opposite, and she'd been beaten up. She was crying. She said that Cecil was dead. The police were called, and Cecil was had been shot in his bed. He was dead, looked like he was still asleep. She'd been beaten up. She had black eyes and a bloody lip and scratches all over her face. And they took her to hospital. And she said that two men had broken in at about 2 a.m. And she'd just woken up to see two men there. One of them had grabbed her, knocked her out, and the other one had just shot her husband. The problem was, as I'm sure the police saw at the time, is that they lived on the top floor of the building. So usually thieves don't go to the top floors of buildings if they're trying to burgle buildings, because, you know, it's a longer way to get down to escape. Secondly, people don't usually open the door to anyone at that time of night for them to have broken in. There are also another number of things which I talk about in the book. You know, there was supposed to be money and jewelry missing, but then it was found. And then very soon after, the police got a tip that Diane Wells, the wife, had been having an affair. And the affair that she was having, and this was a bigger deal really than almost the murder, she'd been having an affair with a black musician called Johnny Warren. And he had just left town that very night, which of course made him look very guilty.
Yeah.
And so his license plate went straight out on the wires. She gave an interview to the police, stuck to her story. They eventually caught up with Johnny Warren down in Oakland in California, because he'd driven down, which of course, you know, took several days to drive down. At the time, most people didn't drive. Most people tended to fly or take steamboats up the side of the coast. There really going by road wasn't the best option, and train wasn't great either. It just took an enormous amount of time. Mm-hmm. So the police went round to him. He voluntarily talked to the police, confirmed that there was an affair, that they had been intimate relations was the term that was used. And the fact that he was a black man, he was also married as well, that became a bigger deal than the murder almost. Mm-hmm. But the issue was that Cecil Wells was very, very prominent, very wealthy, very successful. He was the head of the Chamber of Commerce. He would have been a big political player, and he'd been shot in his bed. And a few months before, another local businessman who was very influential had also been shot in a robbery as well. So there was a bit of pressure on to find out who had done it. So the pressure was on, and it seemed like there was a number of strong possibilities for what may have happened. And so the Diane Wells and Johnny Warren were indicted, and the arrest warrants went out, and they were both arrested and extradited, because again, Alaska was a territory, so they had to be extradited back to where they were. And they were charged with first-degree murder, and they said, okay, the trial's going to be, I think it was about 4 or 5 months' time. And they didn't find the murder weapon, but the trial was set, and Diane had enough money to be able to get bail. As hard as it is to imagine you can get bail for murder, but again, it's a territory. And so she left, and she came down to Los Angeles and spent about 5 months here. And that was kind of where I had a bit of a connection to the story, because I could research it a little more and knew a little bit about where she went and what she did. And so of course, then there's a million other factors involved. There was a third suspect, and there were several other theories, which is what the family members told me, and the friends, what they thought had happened, or what they'd always been told had happened. And those theories went from, you know, Diane Wells did it, Johnny Warren did it, it was organized crime, it really was a break-in, it was something else. And so in the book, I have to look into all of these particular potential theories and try and come up with the idea of what actually happened on the night of the murder, because they never found the murder weapon. And it was during my research of the book that I spoke to one of the investigators of the murder at the time, his daughter. And she said she remembered the case and that her father talked about it. and she gave me his like unpublished, memoirs and some
Oh,
of his notes and things. Yeah. And that was a good moment, because he mentioned a couple of things in the memoirs that gave me pause. He also had said publicly at the time that he didn't think that Johnny Warren, the musician, was involved in the murder. He didn't think he was the killer. And he said that publicly. And so what you've got after a few weeks is you've got two people who've been arrested. You've got Johnny Warren, the musician, who basically people have said publicly it wasn't him. So then you've got Diane Wells, who's left, who's the wife. And, she's pretty much branded, being younger and blonde and attractive. She's, of course, branded as the, the gold digger.
mm-hmm.
She was the one who was always in it for the money, and she must have killed him for the money, or killed him out of jealousy or something like that. But of course, like any family story, I think, because we all have our family moments, there's so much more involved in that. And that was what I found out. Diane had two previous daughters, which Cecil may or may not have known about. She'd certainly lost touch with them. Now, I spoke to both of the daughters, and one of them I actually went to see in Texas, and she said, well, my mother took me to school when I was 5, and I never saw her again. She never saw her again. And so that was one of the daughters that I'd spoken to, and she gave me a lot of pictures. And, I tell you, when she came down the stairs, it was like looking at an older version of her mother.
Oh my goodness.
Of course, as it would do, because she was the eldest child, but it was uncanny. I was like, oh my God, I can see what your mother would have looked like, at an older age. And I spent a couple of days talking to her, and she was so kind and generous. And I just thought, I've got to try and give her some sort of sense of what happened, because, she was, one of 3 children in the end who, lost their mother and their father,
right.
In the end, and really had spent their whole lives thinking that, my mother was a murderer, and that was really what drove the whole story. But it went off in so many other directions, and I'm sure, many of your authors have said this, but, you couldn't make it up. There's nothing stranger than people and what people do. And I found lots of stuff that's 90% of it's in the book. There's some stuff I couldn't put in, but I found stuff that I knew a lot of the people I talked to didn't know.
Amazing. It'll be quite, and I assume they've all had the book early and have had the opportunity to read it.
Yeah, that was a tricky one. I wondered whether I should send them, an advance idea of what they'd written or what they'd said and how it was. And I just thought, no, I can't get into that. I also thought it wasn't a situation where I could be like a counselor or try and sort of facilitate any sort of family discussion. I thought that's not my business to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I thought I'd stick, this is why, mystery books are great, but fiction, I find impossible, because you have to make it up. I love doing, nonfiction stuff, because you can't really make any of it up. Because if it's in the newspaper and people told it to you, these people are telling me what they thought of something that happened 70 years ago. And I'm sure, their memory might be different from what actually happened, but it's what they told me. It's not what I made up. And that made it a little easier. I mean, I gave them some idea. I didn't put everything in that they all told me. And there was one particular person who told me an enormous amount about his life. And he had second thoughts about it and said, can you take some of these things out? Mm-hmm. And so I took them out, because mm-hmm. I had no desire to upset anybody now.
No,
it wasn't worth it. It really wasn't. If someone had given me a deathbed confession, of course I would have put that in, but that didn't happen. I assumed at the beginning of this, the first person I would meet who was connected to the family would go, oh yes, well, it never went to trial, but this is what really happened. I assumed it was just sort of general knowledge, because Fairbanks and Alaska, they're small places and everyone knows each other's business. I just assumed something as, notorious as that, everyone would go, oh yeah, well, it never went to trial, but this is what happened, But
you didn't find that.
No, I mean, everybody was really had, it was just not talked about. It was just never talked about. And it was just like, well, he died, or he was murdered, or, she did this or he did this. And, I'd be listening and I going, well, that didn't happen. I know for sure that didn't happen. But, you don't want to, ruin whatever they've been thinking for 50 or 60 years.
Right.
Because it doesn't, you don't want to be telling someone, well, I think your mother's a murderer. You don't really want to be doing that, but, and that's not the conclusion, that I came to. But I certainly think there were, like I say, I talk about the third suspect, who was named publicly as the third suspect in the case. He had a very interesting history, and I've managed to talk to his granddaughter. And I talked to his granddaughter, and her mother, his daughter, is still alive. She said, my mother never talks about it, ever. Never talks about him in any way whatsoever. And I said, well, but I mean, what was he like? She never talks about it.
Ooh,
Ever talks about it.
That's interesting. That's very
yeah. And so she told me a few things, and I said, well, if you get the chance, maybe. She said, no, she won't talk about it. She won't talk about it. She will never talk. She's never talked about it to me. And so, and I found out what happened to this guy. I found out where he ended up living and what he did and when he died and everything. And she's read the book. She might know now. But I just thought, it's not my business to go and say, well, what did your mother say? Did you talk to your mother and tell her? Because maybe she doesn't want to know.
Exactly.
You know,
we're also used to the high technology that we have today, and everything can be identified and traced and all of those things. And when you think what it was like at that time, you wonder that anything was ever solved.
Yeah, I mean, we're all so used to the idea of DNA and fingerprints, and DNA, of course, didn't even exist up until the 80s. It wasn't used for a start. Now, in a particular crime scene here, they did collect fingerprints. They did collect some blood stains and things with blood on them. And I got the FBI file, so I have the reports that they got. But in those days, all they could tell you was the blood group that it was. Mm-hmm. And of course, the blood group was, Cecil's blood group and Diane's blood group. And that would make sense because they were both, physically, beaten.
Right.
It would make sense that their blood was there, so they had some blood evidence. They had the fingerprints, which they never managed to get anything particularly well done due to, as I said, the local chief of police. He tried to get a local facility to work out the fingerprints before sending them to the FBI, which he probably shouldn't have done. And they didn't really get anything, and it kind of ruined them. So they never really got a usable fingerprint. They tried to match them to 7 or 8 people over the preceding years, when they were trying to bring it to trial. They tried 7 or 8 people and never got a match. So whoever it was either a complete stranger or the fingerprints weren't particularly great. There was also a pair of pajamas, which I even went so far in my research as to find the pair of the pajamas from the period with the design to show that they actually existed. They had little cowboy on them. There was a pair of pajamas that had something to do with the night of the murder, but the police never picked those pajamas up, and they were never examined. So of course, today we would know, well, that completely takes that off the table. If they weren't taken at the time, forget it.
Right.
If there was a pair of pajamas that they never got to. And, it was a bit of a case of, they got a little bit, blinkered initially early on as to what they thought had happened. And I think probably what they imagined happened was probably right, but with the benefit of hindsight and the benefit of talking to the people and to their family members and so forth, you get a more of a rounded sense of a picture. So in a sense, the book is, or at least the summary chapters of the book, are kind of like the trial, where they say, okay, so how did this come about? Why would that have happened? Why would that have happened? You say, well, because of this, and because of this, and because of this. And if it happened today, I don't think we would draw the same conclusions and be so harsh. But, it was a great story, and she was all over the papers. And, every person You know, I mean, some of the pictures, every man or woman I spoke to, the women especially, they were like, she was beautiful. She was the most beautiful woman in town. You know, she was absolutely stunning.
Which makes her a target anyway.
Yeah.
For gossip and everything.
Yeah, it makes a gossip thing. I mean, that was, I'm convinced that's one of the reasons why she left and came down to LA, because, you know, LA had 2 million people living in it. You know, if she wanted to get away from gossip and wanted to try and spend some time on her own, you go to a big city. Right. You know, like we said, you always have to fly through Seattle. You could have gone to Seattle. A lot of people used to fly down to San Francisco often. That was a big city, but she came down to LA. She had friends in LA, or they were family friends, and she stayed with them, and she brought her son with her and enrolled her in school. And they tried to have, you know, for 6 months, like a regular life where she wasn't bothered and didn't have anyone gossiping. But, you know, there was more to it than that. And as far as, you know, the pulp magazines and stuff, you know, she was the absolute femme fatale. You know, she was the absolute femme fatale, and you know, all the women that I spoke to were like, you know, she was a nice person, she was lovely, but you know, I'd never heard the term card girl before. No, and what is that? Well, card girl is like the idea of like being working in a cocktail bar or a casino, that kind of thing. A casino, like a bimbo or a gold digger, that kind of thing. Oh. And that was what some of the people described that she was like. You know, she met Cecil in a bar and they married very quickly and that kind of thing. And, you know, because I checked to see, you know, if she was pregnant, whether it was like a shotgun wedding, you know, but it wasn't a shotgun wedding. And, you know, Diane's daughter, her eldest daughter, who, like I say, she was estranged from all her life, had a lot of pictures of Cecil and Diane together when they were married. They seemed very happy. You know, they seemed to do a lot of traveling. And this was when people didn't really travel. You know, they went to Peru and Mexico and places like that. They seemed to have a happy life. But, you know, as is often the case, you know, sometimes what the public see and what happens behind closed doors is different. And that certainly came into play. It's fascinating. And it's something that you could go on and on speculating about. Yeah, I mean, you really could. I got a phone call today. I was hoping it would be more of a revelation that I could expose to you tonight, but I got a call from one of the people who I mentioned in the book. I quote her because we spoke. So she's obviously she's an elderly lady now because she was a child at the time when it happened, and her parents were very close to Cecil and Diane. They were very close. They were business friends, they were personal friends and so forth. And she had told me while I was doing my research that she thought it was a mob hit. It was organized crime. Oh. Cecil was killed because, you know, he was shot while he was in bed. You know, it was one shot to the side of the head, you know. Right. And was it proven that he was involved with? Well, I do talk about one of the chapters that I did explore it. I did look into the possibilities of, you know, whether there was really any organized crime in Alaska. But, you know, the problem bit, Anchorage, I could possibly believe because there was a lot of people living there. Fairbanks was so small. There was certainly a lot of money and a lot of men around. But the terms of the money and what might have been involved, plus the police and the FBI files never mentioned anything about organized crime. Okay. And if that was a valid direction, I think they would have mentioned it, but they never mentioned it. But she said, well, my father was very much involved in organized crime, and he said that, you know, Cecil was a hit, and, you know, that he was in danger of his life at a time, and I think it was an organized crime. So she called me the other day and said, I have more information. And I spoke to her about an hour and a half before I spoke to you, and I was hoping that she'd bust open the case or something, but what she told me was pretty much the same. She had some more information about what she felt had happened, and that she still was fairly convinced it was an organized crime. And she talked about her father's business dealings and how she thought he was involved with organized crime. And as such, Cecil being a good friend and a business, he might have been involved, and it was a hit. And she also mentioned, you know, when Cecil died, you know, my grandfather got some of the stuff from the house, some of the china and things like that. And you know, the crime scene photos, there's a big cabinet full of all this china. And she was saying, you know, I've got pictures of it. You know, we got that from the house, you know, after the murder. And I was like, whoa, that's crazy. So it's all still something that's alive to a lot of people, and other people who have seemed unconnected entirely have, you know, I got in touch with them and they go, oh yes, you know, my father never stopped talking about that all his life. He talked about that every single week when we go out for breakfast. He would talk about it every week about the murder of his friend, and he always thought it was this, and this, you know. And the family hired private detectives, and the family hired the Pinkertons at one stage to look into the murder. Yeah, I found that in just briefly, but they did hire the Pinkertons, and other friends and family members put up rewards and paid for extra money to look into the crime, but it never got solved. Or rather, I guess, no one went to prison for it. Right. I think is the difference. That there's a difference between it being solved and someone being convicted of the crime.
It sounds fascinating. And the cover, do you have one handy? Because I'm not.
Yeah, it's a great, I was so pleased with that cover. Now that's her, that's Diane Wells. And the picture is of her at Seattle Airport. Yeah. And you can see it's paparazzi of the day with their cameras.
Yes.
And that was a picture, and she looked so frightened in that picture. And there's only a few pictures I've got of her at the time, and most of them, she looks like that, bloody terrified and frightened, because she just got off the plane at Seattle there, and all the newspaper reporters and the photographers had taken pictures of her, and she'd been arrested immediately. Mm-hmm. And charged with murder. And then she
very dramatic cover.
Yeah, it's a really good cover. There's only a few pictures of her at that time with the, you know, with the mink coat on, a very expensive coat. You know, Cecil bought her a lot of stuff, which all ended up getting off auctioned in LA, believe it or not. But yeah, that's a picture of her, and I just thought that is such a noir picture.
It is, definitely.
Yeah, you'd think that'd be made up for a movie, but that was a real picture.
And if everybody notices, James is wearing a pin, and I have one on too. You'll see it later. He sent me several of those and several evidence cards for you lucky people who buy his book.
These are real evidence tags, and so I've signed them. So if you buy a book from Anne, you get their signature, which is on the evidence tag, and you get a little one of these badges, of which there's about 3 left. So that they are collector's items now. I only did 50 to start with.
No, and they're wonderful because they're so clear. And
yeah, that was another of the pictures that they used a lot. That was, again, you can see she's still wearing the fur coat, so it's taken at the same time. But that was the picture that used a lot, where, you know, it looks like she's up against a wall about to be executed. You know, I mean, that's
in both cases, she has this kind of blank, stunned look on her face.
Yeah, she was absolutely stunned. She was railroaded. I mean, you know, I don't want to be give an opinion, but I think it was, you know, the dice was cast, and you know, the press was very against her, and you know, in relation to what happened later, which I'm not going to give as a spoiler, but
no,
it's a very sad story on every level, really. There's really only 2 or 3 people I met who you know, have had a happy life or seem to be relatively okay with what happened. It really did affect so many people, and that was the thing that surprised me. You know, people who never forgot and really never had any idea of what happened.
Well, and your timing is amazing because you're getting these people in their later years. You know, if you'd waited another few years, you would have missed out on.
It's been sad because there have been 2 or 3 people I've spoken to who have passed on since doing this. There was a lady I spoke to just before I went to press. She was 96, and she knew Diane Wells at the time when Diane moved to Fairbanks with Cecil. And she was basically her, I guess, like a consort, you know, was like a good friend to her when she arrived in town, because she said, you know, well, when I moved to Fairbanks, it was a culture shock for me. So, you know, Cecil asked me, will you sort of help Diane, you know, integrate into local life? Because it's a bit of a change. And she knew her really well, and they hung out. And like I say, she was 96 now. And I had a short conversation with her, and she just told me 2 or 3 things. And I was like, whoa, okay. And it's so sad. I sent out the emails to the people who'd done the book, and she just died like the week before.
Oh, that's so
And
sad.
I wish, yeah, it was sad. And I knew she wasn't well, but and she'd said to me, I'd love to know what happened because it was such a tragedy. So there were several people that I talked to who could really only remember a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But, it was 1953. I mean, there's, everyone who was around at the time were children, and children didn't get talk about anything like that at the time.
No, they wouldn't.
No.
No, the whole thing is fascinating, and you've just wrapped it up in this package. I just think that you've already had good success with this, and I suspect as more people get to read it, I like the things that you've inserted in there, some handwritten notes.
Yeah.
There were other things. I love when people do that in a book when they're talking about the real thing.
Yes, especially true crime books. I read a fair few, and I love it when they put pictures in of the people, because then you know what they look like. And I like it when they put actual things from the crime. So in this case, there was the love letters, obviously, that went between Diane and musician Johnny Warren, that proved that they were in a relationship. So there were the love letters, and there were
it adds so much to the book when you're reading it. And the photographs are wonderful that you have in here. It's altogether just a great book.
Oh, well, thanks. I'm so glad. I believe you me, I've had many, many stressful nights worrying about it. But I like when I wrote it, I was like, I would read this book. I thought that's what I thought. I would read that book. And then I guess if no one else likes it, at least I would read it and think, well, that was interesting. God, how interesting. And hopefully other people will think the same. That's what I was hoping.
I am sure they will, because it's so well done. And like I said, you've included so many things in there visually as well as the story itself. It makes a tremendous difference. It makes you feel like you're a part of them, and you can visualize them in situations that you've written about.
Yeah.
And now, taking a leap. Yes, I've got somebody saying, I'm buying a book, actually.
That's great. Thank you. Who's that? Thank you, Carol.
Yeah. You've done this and you've wrapped yourself in it for how long?
It was 4 or 5 years on and off.
Okay.
I mean, COVID really helped. That really made me push to finish it, because, we couldn't go and do anything else or go anywhere.
Exactly. But so it's going to take a while, and maybe it's already begun, to get this out of your system and not be all encompassing. Have you already thought or started what's next?
Well, what I have found out is that once now I've done this book, people have lots of suggestions of their local murders, that their local unsolved murders that they want me to try and solve, which is nice. It's really nice that people were engaged enough. There were a couple of stories that I heard about when I was doing my research in Fairbanks that I thought were really interesting. There was like a sort of a one from around World War II where there was, without giving you a long story, but Fairbanks was involved in World War II in relation to a scheme for planes going to fight over in Japan and in Russia. So there were a lot of Russian pilots stationed in Fairbanks, and they would literally pick up a plane in Fairbanks and fly across into the Pacific Theater of War and into Russia as well.
It wasn't that far away.
No, it wasn't that far away. That was really when suddenly Fairbanks or Alaska specifically became really important, was the Second World War. And there was an incident at the time where a soldier was showing around a couple of Russians locally, and then the American soldier was found dead in a lake. And there was not much said, and it was kind of brushed over at the time, but it seems, looking back, it certainly seems that what the Russians were probably doing was trying to have a look at some of the communications and stuff, which they shouldn't have been doing, and probably killed this soldier when he found out. But because of what was happening, they had to let it go because they needed the planes more, and they needed for the overall war effort. That's a really interesting idea. And but as I found out on this story, I can't go back too far because all the people aren't alive anymore to interview. Right. And then when you get more contemporary, a lot of the time that the story's already been looked into. The story's already been looked into, and I'm not so keen on trying to come up with an alternative theory. If there's already a book out there, let that book play. Right. So what I've been doing is I've been going through my ghost guides, the guides that I wrote to LA, and look at some of those old true crimes. Because I wrote something a little while ago, just a blog post about a guy in the late 30s, which is even further back, but in the late 30s, about a guy who was a pirate off Catalina Island. He chartered a boat and then killed the captain, threw him overboard, attached the anchor, and held the crew hostage for 5 days before 2 of the crew managed to overpower him and throw him overboard and fed him to the sharks. Now, you wouldn't think that happened anymore, would you? And that happened in 1938. And the yacht was lost for 5 days, and they put, SOS on the sail. And then eventually the Navy found them, and the story came out. It was a big sensation. It was in the detective magazines, but they had no bodies, so it never went to trial. The captain had been thrown overboard, and the guy whose name was, Jack Morgan, believe it or not, like Captain Jack Morgan, that was really his name. Of course, his body wasn't there, so they only had the words of the people on board the yacht. And of course, one of the people on the yacht was, Jack Morgan's wife. Oh. So it's a great story, but the problem with that is that no one who was alive is around to talk about it. Mm-hmm. So I'll just have to see if something really grabs me and makes me think,
So I get the impression then that you are going to stick with true life, true things that have happened that your interest.
Yeah, just because it's like I say, fiction, that just seems way too hard. It's working out plot and stuff like that. I just don't know how people do it. Whereas something that's true life, you can look at it and go, wow, that actually happened to somebody. Why did that happen? What happened to them? And what happened to them after.
Now, I don't have any more questions up here. You folks can either type in the questions or we can open it up.
I'll put my email if anyone wants to ask something, because there's a million other things that are about this story and stuff that you might not want to ask now or think of something later, but.
Yeah. Have you unmuted yourselves? I know he would like to answer questions.
You can ask me anything you like. You can ask me anything you like, or I haven't really got any physical things to show you. I mean, one of the coolest things that happened was when I was getting some of these archive materials from the state archives in Alaska. When they sent me the crime scene photos and stuff, which they'd kept. I mean, I didn't even think they might have kept them, but they did. And they sent me the photos and all those documents. They were very, very nice. God bless the archivists and librarians. And I said, this is great. Was there anything else, that was in the file? And they said, oh yeah, there was one other thing, but I couldn't photocopy it. I couldn't make a scan of it, but I'll take some pictures. And it was a necklace that Diane Wells had obviously been wearing the night of the murder, and it had obviously been broken, and they'd kept all the pieces of the necklace. And it was like this. I haven't been able to buy any, but you'll recognize it because I think we all remember it from the time. They're too big, but it's these kind of like the red coral.
Oh, yes.
Those bits of red coral?
It was very popular.
Yes, yeah. The actual necklace was that the pieces were much smaller than these, because these are like the size of chili peppers, but they were little. They looked like tiny little twigs, Mm-hmm. And these bits of this necklace were in an envelope, and the archivist took a picture of them next to a quarter to show the size, and they had been kept as evidence. And so I guess she'd been wearing them. It was either a bracelet or a necklace. And it had been broken in the struggle when something happened, and they had kept it as evidence, but it had ended up, in the archives. Whereas, the actual evidence from the case, there was a shoe and a briefcase and all of that. I'm sure that was all long destroyed. But seeing that, I was like, holy hell, like she wore that. Yes. She wore that necklace. you know, and that was taken, and it had been in an evidence box for, you know, 65 years.
Amazing.
So what was the connection with Earl Stanley Gardner? I'm trying.
Yes, Earl Stanley Gardner. Yes, that's right. Earl Stanley Gardner, who I'm sure you're all familiar with. He created Perry Mason.
Mhm.
When Cecil Wells was murdered, the Wells family, very much specifically his children, he had 6 children, knew him somehow, and they asked him to recommend a private detective for him. And Earl Stanley Gardner recommended a guy called Bud Bodell, which is the best name for a private detective. And he was exactly a cigar chomping big guy. He was a strike breaker at the Hoover Dam, and he was later the LA coroner, the Las Vegas coroner, as you can imagine. And Earl Stanley Gardner recommended this guy, Bud Bodell, who was a private detective. And Bud Bodell looked into the case and got paid, because I found all the notes of how much money they got paid, because all of the money for this came out of the Wells estate. Mm-hmm. He got paid like 20 or 30 grand to look into it. Couldn't find anything amiss. Also, I was also told that who was the F. Lee Bailey was asked to look into the case. Yeah. Now, I didn't know whether that was true or not, and I was like, F. Lee Bailey. I think he's passed away since, hasn't he? But I looked him up, and he does still have an office. I think it's in Maine. And I emailed the address thinking, how is he possibly ever going to remember this if it's even true? And I got a reply, and it said, no, FLB. So whether that was true or not, I don't know. But yes, Earl Stanley Gardner was involved. Like I say, they hired private detectives. They hired a lie detector expert who did do tests on several of the suspects, because the family really wanted to know who done it. And not because there was a lot of question over money from the will or anything, but they wanted to know who done it. So Earl Stanley Gardner was involved. There were a few celebrities along the way. I mean, the biggest one, which I should have mentioned before, but to give you an idea of how important Cecil Wells was, or how notable, there's actually pictures of Cecil Wells with Walt Disney. Yeah, Walt Disney went up to Alaska. Now, I looked this up because I know Disney people don't mess around. It was in about 1947, I think. Disney and his 2 children, or one of his children, Sharon, his daughter certainly, went up to Alaska to do some research for a series. There became a series of multiple Oscar-winning short films about life in Alaska. And he went up there with a couple of other producers and a couple of businessmen, because they had businesses up there. Anyway, they went to several places, Anchorage and Fairbanks and so forth. And I had been told by several family members that Cecil had met Walt Disney. And I was like, well, you know, of course he had, you know, but then one of them said, no, there's pictures. And he sent me a couple of pictures. And I mean, unless it's a double, it's Walt Disney. So there's a picture of Cecil and Walt Disney. And there's another picture of Walt Disney. There's a couple of pictures of Sharon Disney, the daughter. And I looked it up. I found out in the newspapers that they did go to Alaska. They did go to Anchorage. And I found an actual blog post, because they were interviewed about their trip, I think by the LA Times. And there was a picture of Walt. I mean, you can probably Google it now. There's a picture of Walt and Sharon next to an upturned boat in Alaska. And she's wearing these red shoes, and he's got this fedora on. And the pictures with Cecil, she's got the red boots on, and he's got the fedora on. And I'm certain. So he was one of the people, you know, that was considered, I guess, important enough to show Walt Disney around. And they went to see ground squirrels. That seemed to be the thing of the subject of the pictures, where they were feeding ground squirrels, which, you know, apparently that was supposed to be where Chip and Dale came from, but apparently that's not true. Apparently that's not true, because they were invented quite a few years before this. But that was the story, was that he had met Walt Disney, and the picture is definitely him and Walt Disney.
And I find it fascinating that he would turn to Earl Stanley Gardner for help.
Yeah, I mean,
he's a
because
writer, you know.
I guess, you've got the money and, think of who he was and you would imagine who he knew. He did do, Earl Stanley Gardner did a series, was it called The Court of Something? It was a series of books and then it was a TV series where they looked at miscarriages of justice.
Mhm.
And I would imagine they felt that, well, it wasn't a miscarriage of justice because it hadn't been, gone to trial, but they thought it was a case that maybe deserved to be looked at, and that may be why he got in touch. But yeah, I found the reference to it. There was a reference to it, and he suggested this.
Fascinating.
So he had. So there's a Walt Disney bit. There's a couple of other celebrities and stuff that turned up, but that was just kind of secondary. But the Walt Disney thing was very cool. But it's definitely him. And that's a family.
Now, Catherine posted. How long did it take you to put this story together?
It took about, all in all, it was probably about 5 years totally, but I didn't work on it all the time.
Mhm.
No, I meant you did say it took about 5 years off and on to gather and interview and all that, but I meant once you had everything that you knew you were going to have.
Yeah.
How long from that point forward did it take for you to get a manuscript that you could submit?
Yeah, I went through, I think I did about 3 or 4 drafts in the end. The one, of course, the first one obviously was the one that was hideously overlong. Then I did one that was a little bit probably too shorter. And then I did the final one that I made a little bit longer than, the one that was too short. Because the first one had, every single piece of research, every single, reference number, and which people just don't need to know, because as we said, if any of us have read true crime books before, sometimes there can be too much research and you sort of lose the sense of it actually being a driving story that you're compelled by.
Mm-hmm.
It just gets a little like, okay, I don't need to know absolutely everything that they did that day. It's like, I really tried not to put any court transcripts in particularly, because I do find it incredibly tiresome in books where they do, they go to trial and they'll do like 30 pages of the trial transcript.
Right.
And what I want is the moment where they're caught in a lie, like we see on television. I mean, I'm the worst example, but I want that moment where they're caught in the lie, or the moment where they say something and you go, wait a minute, they didn't say that before. That's the only bit I want in the court transcript. Because otherwise they're just saying their name and their address and what they saw and repeating what they've said before. There is a trial in the book that is related to the murder, but it's not a murder trial, but it is directly related to the murder. And I had the whole transcript of that, and I read it and I read it and I read it, and I just thought, how much of this do people actually need to read? What's the vital thing that they need to take out of it?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I tried to put in, because there was, like I say, that the murder never came to trial, but somebody did go to prison for it. That's the way I kind of sold it.
This has been so interesting, James. Yes. I really appreciate you.
Well, thanks
coming with us. I'm going to hold up your book one more time.
Thank you.
Mine doesn't show. Can you hold yours up?
Yes.
Thank you. Just a very dramatic cover. You went with the right way with that.
Yeah, I had to license that, and even when I was talking to, it was Associated Press, which we've all heard of, and I went on their website to look up books, and it's not even listed, under a name. It's just like Alaska murder suspect, and there were other pictures that I found in magazines and things that had Associated Press on them, and all they didn't even have them. They didn't even have them, and they couldn't license them to me. They were like, well, they don't exist. And I'm like, but I've got the number here. It says it on the back of the photo. But that's because, they just would never have kept them. The newspapers used a lot of freelancers in those days. They didn't keep that stuff, and because it never went to trial, why would they have kept all of those? I was emailing the photographers, the children of the photographers from those days and going, did your dad keep a filing cabinet? Did he ever put his old photos in a filing cabinet? Because they just didn't have them. But that one was especially, as soon as I saw that, I was like, I've got to use that one.
Absolutely. It's perfect. I want to thank you so much, because it's been the most interesting time.
Oh, thanks, Anne. Thanks for having me. Thanks for everyone who turned up.
And don't forget, you'll be on YouTube in about 2 weeks.
Okay.
And we'll have the recording down.
Yeah.
Want to thank you for your time and looking forward. I know everyone's looking forward to this. And Catherine, another comment?
When are you going to get the books in, Anne?
I have them.
Oh, you have them. Okay, so all right.
And these lovely buttons, which I've got on my shirt.
Yeah, there's
and
only
he
5.
has.
So get there quick, because then you get one of each.
Yeah, and the cards are sitting on this table behind me, but you can't see it now because we're looking at James. So, and thank you again so much. This has been fascinating.
Well, thank you. I hope so.
Yes, and thanks, everybody's applauding.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. Thank you.